presidential candidate and Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard's plan to combat coronavirus takes a unique approach, a universal basic income for every American. So in this plan, every American citizen would get $1,000 a month until coronavirus is no longer a public health emergency. She said that this solution would provide economic relief, quote, directly into the hands of every American rather than getting stuck in bureaucracy or ending up in the pockets of big corporations.
Joining us now to discuss her resolution is Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard herself. Congresswoman, it's great to see you back on the Rise and
Always
Set.
have you.
Absolutely.
Thanks
for braving it in order to come here. Tell us a little bit about the proposal, the reception it's received so far on Capitol Hill, and why what we're seeing so far from Congress and the administration is not adequate to meet the moment.
You know, a lot of attention is really focused, as is the case when there are, big crises or things that we're facing in the countries. Well, let's look at Wall Street. Let's look at these major industries. Let's look at how they can get some kind of stability. But every single time, virtually, it is the everyday American who's completely left behind holding the bag. Mm-hmm. I've been talking with some of my friends who are active duty service members, and, they're going out and buying supplies for their families and stocking up and spending a few $100 to do so. And you think of like a private, an E3 or an E4 in the military, they're paycheck to paycheck. Some of them are even on food stamps. And so then it starts to hit home. Most Americans don't have that safety emergency bank account, even for a short term, what to speak of if you're talking about weeks, or in this case, people are looking at potentially months. And so really looking at this universal basic payment, an emergency direct aid to every single American, I think makes absolutely the most sense.
Mm-hmm. And so why go in that direction of just, we're going to give everybody $1,000? You know what people say, oh, well, you're going to give rich people $1,000 when they don't need it, et cetera, et cetera. Why go in that direction instead of something more targeted, like we're going to have a moratorium on foreclosures, moratorium on evictions, moratorium on maybe public utility shutoffs? Is it a both?
We need to do that
do we need both and?
We do. We need to do both. We need to make sure that, and we are working on something this morning that directly speaks to the foreclosures, to the big banks, saying cancel all foreclosure efforts, especially right now as people's economic stability is so uncertain. So we need to go on all fronts to be able to not only bring some peace of mind to Americans that whether you have a job or you've gotten laid off or you're worried about it, or you're an Uber driver and you're working on the gig economy, or you're a freelance worker, whatever your specific circumstance is, we need to make sure that that stability is there and that people have the cash to be able to continue. Like that is direct economic stimulus. And you're not talking about kind of this, well, we'll wait for it to trickle down from the big, tourism industry or whatever, down to the workers who really may or may not have a job.
Who may need it right now.
They do need it right now. Absolutely.
That's one thing that struck Crystal and I about this, is it seems that they're litigating fights that should have happened like a month ago, like on paid sick leave. It's like the sheer economic destruction that's happening to everyday people's lives is only going to spiral more out of control. Do people in Congress get it? Do they understand what is actually happening to people's lives? Because the slow crawling nature of the legislative process, some people can't afford to wait for that. This is having real damage.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are some who do, but most who don't. I was really shocked. Yeah, I think it was yesterday morning when the Senate said, hey, we're going to go out of session for 10 days, and then we'll come back and just figure out, hey, what do we need to do then? This is an emergency. People are really, really concerned about themselves, their parents, their loved ones, their kids potentially being sent home from school. I mean, there's so many ramifications to this that it is a good thing that they came to their senses, canceled the recess in the Senate. We're hoping to be able to vote on a direct aid package later in the House today. Again, I'm pushing for this direct universal basic payment because I think it is the most simple, most direct way to help people who need help immediately.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm really glad to hear your ideas on it. What has the reception been like, at least for Democrats on the Hill? Have they been open to this idea?
I think increasingly more so, but there's still a lot of skepticism, kind of raising some of the questions. Well, what about people who don't need it? We only want to help people who are in that dire situation, who have lost their jobs, for example. But I think it's important that leaders really look at the larger scope here, that there are greater challenges that people are facing, even those who haven't lost their job, or those who may be underemployed may check that employment box, but really, they're making less than 25 grand a year and trying to figure out how do you plan for an emergency like this and all of the uncertainties that go with it. And I think really what this comes down to, and the message that I'm driving home on Capitol Hill is, y'all are very worried about these massive corporations and what economic impact will have on them and on the Wall Street banks. We have to put the interest and the well-being of every single American at the forefront and not leave the American taxpayer once again holding the bag.
That's exactly right.
I also want to ask you, Congresswoman, just about the response itself. I mean, given your military experience and the unit that you served in overseas, how can you evaluate what's happening right now? Maybe what are some of the things that we need to see kick in immediately, and what role can Congress play in that?
It's been incredibly frustrating. We just had a briefing yesterday morning where we had Dr. Fauci, we had the CDC, the FDA, the Surgeon General, a whole panel of the people who are responsible for this response across the federal government and the executive branch. And I think uniformly, Democrats and Republicans who were in that briefing walked away very frustrated, because we are so far behind where we need to be, and we are far behind where many other countries in the world are, especially as it relates to testing. This is something that's been talked about a lot, but we're not seeing the kinds of actual results and delivery of tests to anybody and everybody who needs it. No difficult pre-screening or red tape or forms or approvals. If you're feeling like you need to get a test, get a test, and it's got to be free and accessible for every single American. I think that we don't know how bad it is here in the United States because we are seeing it so difficult to be able to get those tests.
Yeah, which hinders the ability to respond, which feeds fear, because people go, gosh, we don't even know where it is, who has it, where the clusters are, et cetera.
And so, to add to that point, because this is something that came up yesterday that was infuriating, was we know the most vulnerable population are our elderly, our parents and grandparents, people who are living in nursing home facilities, and they're not even sending clear guidance and prioritizing the testing of healthcare workers who are working in these nursing homes.
Wow.
And it was just, there was some heated exchanges there in that briefing, because it was, I get a sense that there's not strong leadership saying, this is the standard that we're sending out to every nursing home worker, every healthcare facility worker, every hospital worker, that those who are on the front lines should be tested, because if you're testing positive, you need to get out of that environment where you're not in a, where you're not in a position where you're potentially spreading it from one patient to another. And this is a legislation this is something I've been calling for a long time. There's lack of transparency in hospital-borne infections and how they are passed, so that those who are looking at a nursing home or a hospital, they can say, okay, well, gosh, the rates are much higher in one than another. This is something that should be transparent and open for every person in this country to make an informed decision.
Yeah, well, I mean, to Sagar's point, that's like something that should have been done before this crisis. And now you're behind the eight ball because of the situation that our working class has already been in and our elderly have already been in. What answers were you able to get about these tests? Like, what happened? What went wrong? What is going on?
The answer that we keep getting over and over is the systems are not in place, which is
get the systems in place.
That's obvious. That's exactly. And then so that's the follow-up is, okay, so we understand the systems are not in place, that what they're saying is traditionally our healthcare system is built around the fact that you have to go to a doctor before you can go and get a referral, a prescription, or whatever. And so the concept of setting up a drive-through testing station, like we've seen working very well in countries like South Korea, in Scotland, and in others, to be able to get these thousands of tests done a day, for some reason, they're not able to comprehend how to quickly change the system to execute that. And when we say, okay, so what's the timeline? You recognize the problem. What are you doing to fix it? And by when will you have thousands of tests available for people with very quick responses? And the best response that we got is, well, we're working on it. We know it's a problem and we're working on it. Meanwhile, we are weeks into this crisis. And as you said, people are afraid, people are concerned, they're not knowing what they should do, and wanting to protect their loved ones.
I also wanted to ask you, I mean, you have this robust plan, and yet for some reason you're not going to be on the debate stage on Sunday. Are you frustrated with the DNC? I mean, I'm sure the answer is yes. But it's more like, I mean, why are
a safe assumption, Sagar.
Why are they doing this? I mean, like this is a good plan. It's something that needs to be debated before some of these candidates, and I'd love to see Biden and Bernie Sanders respond to it. They have, I just want to give you the opportunity to respond to them, and they're keeping you out of the conversation, which is totally unjustified.
I agree, and it is voters who lose at the end of all of this. They lose because they're not able to have a more informed and vigorous debate about issues like this coronavirus, how we should respond. Obviously, we've talked a lot about foreign policy. This continues to be a very minor focus, not only for the candidates, but in most of these debates. When, yes, with the cost of war as a major issue, but also linking it to issues like the coronavirus, where we see once again that foreign policy is inseparable from domestic policy in a couple of major areas. You know, they're talking about we don't have enough testing kits, funding. We've got $4 billion a month going to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Why are those funds not readily going to pay for something like universal basic payment for every American? And number two, still the lack of global coordination to deal with this global pandemic, where with Iran, for example, we have heavy sanctions with Iran, a very adversarial relationship, confrontational relationship, and it's happening in isolation. Those sanctions should be lifted. We should be trying to help Iran and these other countries to be able to prevent the spread of this virus, because it's something that affects all of us. If it's happening in Iran, it has the potential to spread across the Middle East. And same goes for these other countries. This is something that we've got to be all in together on.
It's so well said. I mean, it's in moments like this where it really hits home for people. Like, it's not enough just that I have health care and my family, because suddenly it's about the kids that your kids go to school with and who you're riding the bus with and who's walking on the street next to you and who's serving your food and who is coming in, what's going on overseas that's going to come here. What can we do to mitigate all of these challenges? I think that's so well said. Both your competitors, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, gave their responses and laid out some plans yesterday. Senator Sanders seemed to go quite a bit further than Joe Biden. What did you make of both of their responses, though?
I caught snippets of both, so I can't
we won't put you on the spot then.
totality.
We'll put you on the spot.
Look, I think this is a time, whether it's for political candidates or leaders in Washington, there's absolutely no place for politics in this. With President Trump's speech, there were some things that he said that I absolutely agree with. I think he's doing the right thing on. There are other things that I think obviously the administration is missing the mark on, and I'm continuing to push as a member of Congress, using whatever platform I can, just to say, hey, let's continue what's working, let's fix what's broken. Because this is about every single American, it's about our country, and it's about what's happening in the world. And now is the time for us to stand with that solidarity.
Well, and I think it's part of why you have credibility in this, one of the many reasons you have credibility in this conversation, because you have been willing to give this president credit where it's been due and criticism where it's not, something we try to do on this show as well. And so that means that since you haven't just been on every single issue, Trump is bad, Trump is bad, Trump is bad, when he does fall short, you're able to raise your voice in a way that lands more effectively.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm able to work with my Republican colleagues because of that. Because if it's just blind partisanship, there's no space for conversation. There's no space for any substance.
The last question I had for you is, obviously we have primaries coming up on Tuesday in states, Florida and Arizona in particular have very elderly populations. Florida's had, I think, 45 cases already. Schools are canceled. Polling stations are already being moved. We talked to the Ohio State chair of the Democratic Party. He said volunteers poll workers are dropping out because they tend to be elderly and they're concerned, rightly so. What adjustments do you think should be made to the primaries? Is it, do we shift the dates? Do we encourage more early voting? What do you think should happen there?
Yeah, I think it's a state-by-state situation. Voting by mail is something that I think is probably very smart to look at, seeing, hey, how quickly, Tuesday's coming up quick, but how quickly can these things be deployed? I think it's going to have to be made on a state-by-state level, keeping in mind that the goal should be maximal participation in our democracy, and not creating barriers where you're changing polling stations at the last second, where people are going to one
people
place.
in long lines.
Right,
Yes,
and not knowing where to go, and people are going during their lunch break or whatever. So I think it's important to just make sure that if it means, hey, we've got to push it back a week, I don't know, that seems reasonable to me.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you.
For joining us.
Great to have you.
Thank you.
you.
Always.
We'll have more Rising for you right after this.